If you look at indigenous people living in the United States today, you may have a question. You may be uncomfortable asking this question. The question is simply, why do so many native people look white? Why is their skin so pale? The answer is kind of unsurprising. It has to do with the history of colonialism. In this video, we're going to be looking at this really important but still kind of murky question. But in some sense, the answer is fairly quick. It has to do with intermarriage, assimilation, and colonial policies. It has to do with survival, and it has to do with a problematic racial history. The history of intermarriage and assimilation during the colonial era in North America, which is where this story begins, is complex, and it varies greatly depending on the time period. But with each European power, we see the persistence of things like intermarriage. In the Spanish colonies, for instance, there is something called mestizaje. In Spanish-held territories, which included much of what is now South America, Central America, and parts of what is the US, the Spanish colonial system somewhat endorsed intermarriage between Spaniards and indigenous people. This is partly due to the relatively small number of Spanish women who emigrated, so they had to produce children somewhere, and the indigenous people were most of the women in the population. The resulting mixed-race population, who were known as mestizos, often played a fairly unique role in colonial societies. They acted as intermediaries, or they occupied various socioeconomic niches. The Spanish also implemented, in the resulting mixed-race tumult, they implemented a complex castas system. Castas, which you might know more as the English word caste. This categorized people based on their ancestry. The system recognized numerous mixed categories which regulated individuals' rights, social status, and economic opportunities. This categorization influenced social mobility and personal identity, encouraging some level of integration and assimilation, albeit within a highly stratified society. Of course, the Spanish weren't the only Europeans present in North America. In the French colonies, there were equivalents to what we've just talked about. So instead of mestizos in Spain, in France, in the French colonies, we have métis. In French territories, particularly in parts of Canada, there was a significant degree of intermarriage between French fur traders, and that was the primary industry of French North America, and indigenous women. This led to the emergence of a distinct group called the métis, who were recognized for their mixed heritage. The French often viewed alliances with the Native Americans through marriage as beneficial for trade and political alliances. Unlike the Spanish, though, the French did not have a formal system like the castas. Intermarriage was seen as a tool for both economic and social integration, helping to stabilize the relationships between French people and indigenous people and extend their influence. In the British colonies, in British North America, the approach to intermarriage varied significantly. In some areas, especially in the early periods of colonization, there was intermarriage occurring as a means of securing peace and alliances with various tribes. Of course, rather celebratedly, there was an intermarriage between the woman that we know now as Pocahontas, although her indigenous name is Mataoka, and John Rolfe, the pioneering tobacco trader. But as the British colonies grew and racial ideologies hardened, intermarriage was increasingly discouraged and sometimes fairly legally constrained. The British did, however, promote the assimilation of Native Americans by encouraging them to adopt English customs, languages, and economic practices. This was evident in policies that aimed to civilize Native Americans, like later on we'll see that the establishment of boarding schools did this. Really where this kicks into hyperdrive is the 19th century. The phenomenon of lighter skin among Native Americans, which is often perceived as quote-unquote white skin, becomes more prevalent due to several historical factors, most notably increased intermarriage and the assimilation policies of the era. Okay, so intermarriage. As American settlers were pushing westward throughout the 19th century, there were more and more interactions between Native Americans and European settlers. This period thus, unsurprisingly, saw a rise in intermarriage between Native Americans and whites, partly due to the dynamics of frontier life where populations were mixed and social norms from eastern settlements were less rigid. Intermarriage was sometimes used as a strategic alliance between trader settlers and native tribes. Marriages could solidify trade relationships or peace treaties. The children of these unions sometimes bridged cultural divides, but also began to integrate more European genetic traits like white skin into the Native American gene pool. And all this gets really accelerated by forced assimilation. The 19th century is marked by aggressive policies that sought to assimilate Native Americans into white Euro-American culture. The U.S. government and other organizations established schools in the late 19th century where Native children were taught to reject their culture and adopt white ways. These schools are very far from tribal lands, and children were sometimes forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their traditions. The General Allotment Act of 1887, better known as the Dawes Act, aimed to assimilate Native people by breaking up tribal lands into individual allotments for Native American families and surplus lands sold to non-Native people. This policy not only undermined tribal sovereignty, but also encouraged Native Americans to adopt a sedentary agrarian lifestyle that was similar to that of white Americans, further fostering integration and increasing intermarriage. Now, in the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, many U.S. States enacted laws that were based on racial purity. This affected who could marry whom and how individuals were racially classified. These laws have the shadow effect of promoting ideals of whiteness and discourages the legal recognition of mixed-race individuals. So, in many cases, lighter-skinned Native Americans might have found it easier to pass as white, offering a strategic advantage in a society dominated by racial segregation and discrimination. Passing as white could provide access to better education, jobs, and a respite from racial persecution. And so intermarriage continues and proliferates, especially as laws sort of open up and prevent the strict forbidding of racial intermarriage in the 20th century. But one thing this does is it sort of makes the phenotype of Native peoples become less and less evident. Now, this will lead to another very sort of uncomfortable question. How is it that having white skin does not at all diminish a claim to Native identity? And to even suggest so is actually quite offensive. It actually is completely ignorant of the history of Native peoples and the history of how these communities work socioeconomically. So first off, what's important to note is that the idea of having lighter or white skin does not diminish Native identity, because identity is multifaceted. It is not solely determined by physical appearance. It does not mean that it's completely flexible, but Native American identity encompasses a variety of elements: cultural heritage, tribal affiliation, community bonds, ancestral lineage, but also individual and collective history. So Native identity is strongly tied to cultural practices, languages, rituals, and traditions that are passed down through generations. Participating in cultural practices often plays a more significant role in community belonging and identity than physical appearance does. But by the way, of course, just because a Native person does not participate in these cultural practices does not make them Native. They can pick those up later in life. They can choose to be distant from it. It does not diminish their Native identity. Many tribes have specific criteria for membership, and these might include lineage, like being descended from a documented tribal member, but they can also include things like cultural knowledge and community involvement. These criteria are really good at prioritizing genealogical and cultural connections over physical characteristics like skin color. Native Americans have a long history of interaction with various other populations, including Europeans, Africans, and others. This has resulted in a diverse range of physical appearances among tribes. So while Native people may look quote-unquote white sometimes, there's also no one way for Native people to look. A Native person from the Southeast looks very different from a Native person from the Pacific Northwest, and both look extremely different from somebody from like Arizona, the Pueblo. And of course, they all look very different than Native people from Alaska and Hawaii. This diversity is understood as part of the historical experience of the communities and is not a determinant of authenticity or identity. So throughout history, Native people have resisted efforts to be defined or delimited by colonial powers or external perceptions. Maintaining a sense of identity has often involved resisting simplistic racial categorizations imposed by outsiders. Many Native Americans self-identify as such, regardless of their skin color. And this is good and fine because identity is often a deeply personal experience and a choice influenced by family, cultural background, and personal convictions. In the U.S., legal recognition as a Native American by the federal government can depend on these different criteria. These legal definitions may complicate how identity is perceived both within and outside Native communities, but the important thing is that physical appearance itself does not solely define these things, especially as we have changing understandings of race. Contemporary understandings of race increasingly recognize that it is by and large a social construct, not a fixed biological or genetic reality. As such, identity is understood to be shaped by a variety of factors, including but not limited to physical appearance.